Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Cutting Edge Librarianship webinar series. I'm Kristen Fonatero from the University of Michigan School of Information. We're so excited that you're joining us today for this session on information privacy in libraries with Florian Schaub from the School of Information and the School of Computer Science and Engineering. This webinar series comes every month, and it's brought to you by the University of Michigan School of Information, the Library of Michigan, and the Institute of Museum and Library Services. And we're so excited to have Florian here for his expert view on the world of privacy and how it relates with libraries. At any point, I should say, you have questions or you have concerns, feel free. I'll be monitoring the chat and we'll save some time for question and answer at the end. Thanks, guys.
All right, thank you, Christine. Hi, everyone. I'm Florian, and let's get started. So, Christine asked me to make this interactive, so I thought we could start with a question. What is privacy to you? How would you define privacy? And feel free to just type in the chat, and I give you a second to find the chat, and we take it from there. All right, any information I want kept to myself. That's a good start. Any other takes? Privacy is having control over what information I want made public or displayed to others. All right. The option not to be identified with personal information for me. Okay, these are all great first intuitive definitions of what privacy is, right? So consent is coming up as well. When we look at where privacy is coming from, the modern interpretation of privacy really started in the late in the 1890s with Warren and Brandeis's paper called "The Right to be Let Alone," and they defined privacy as the right of determining ordinarily to what extent his thoughts, sentiments, emotions shall be communicated to others. So what prompted these two gentlemen back in that time to start thinking about privacy? Does anyone want to take a guess in the chat? All right. It was the Kodak camera. And so around that time, the first instant cameras were available, and you could now carry around cameras and take pictures in ways, in a mobile way that wasn't possible before. And there was a large concern that now instantaneous photographs would be invading the sacred precincts of private and domestic life, and would threaten to make good the prediction that whatever is whispered in the closet shall be proclaimed from the housetops. Right, so they were basically afraid of paparazzi taking photos in the 1890s. Now, when we talk about information privacy these days, we're usually kind of going with the definition by Alan Weston, who defined information privacy as the right of individuals to control, edit, manage, and delete information about themselves, and to decide when, how, and to what extent information is communicated to others. Right, so there's a lot in there, but basically it comes down to transparency and control. You want to have transparency about how data is being collected, and you want to have ability to control who has access to that data. What got Weston to start writing a book called Privacy and Freedom in 1967? The mainframe computer. And so it's the first time that we as a society could actually, or actually not we as a society, governments mostly at this point, could actually collect and gather and harvest and utilize data in large quantities. And an interesting report that came out around that time by the US Privacy Protection Study Commission is something I'd really like to point to, because most people don't know that this report exists, but it's titled Personal Privacy in an Information Society. And in 1977, they said, the real danger is the gradual erosion of individual liberties through automation, integration, and interconnection of many small, separate record-keeping systems, each of which alone may seem innocuous, even benevolent, and wholly justifiable. Right? So that is pretty much still applicable today when we think about what are the main privacy issues we're facing. Now the question is, why should we protect privacy? Why does it matter? Why should we care about privacy? And there are a couple of aspects, right? So privacy is really about intimacy. It's creating space for us separating different parts of our lives in meaningful ways. Privacy also means identity. You need privacy in order to be yourself and also develop who you are, because otherwise you always need to consider, how am I presenting myself to others, right? And privacy is also about autonomy. It's about having a say in who has information about you and how that information is used. What privacy is not about is secrecy, right? So secrecy or confidentiality might be part of how we achieve privacy, but it's not all that matters, right? So privacy is not about hiding things, and it's also this argument that you often hear an argument that people say, oh, I've got nothing to hide, what do I have to worry, right? And Edward Snowden, regardless of what you think of him in general, has a really nice quote on this where he says, well, if you don't care about privacy because you have nothing to hide, that's like saying you don't care about free speech because you have nothing to say, right? So that's just the wrong equation. Privacy is not about hiding things. Privacy is about creating space for individual development. And Daniel Soloff, who is a very well-known legal privacy scholar, has this great resource where he lists like the 10 top reasons why privacy matters, right? We're not going to go through all of them, but basically privacy is much more than secrecy. It has to do with freedom of thought and speech, freedom of social and political activities, right? If you can't gather in private and have discussions in private, it's very difficult to organize politically and also dissent from what is the general social consensus of what is acceptable or isn't acceptable. Privacy is about maintaining appropriate social boundaries, right? Like you don't have to share everything you do or like to do with your colleagues and your friends. You can pick and choose what information about you people have or don't have. Privacy is also about second chances, right? Giving you the ability to change and grow and not have the photos you took when you were a teenager prevent you from getting a job 20 years later. So lots of good reasons, right? And I'm kind of preaching to the choir here because looking at the Code of Ethics of the American Library Association, right, privacy is a fundamental aspect of that. The notion of protecting the right to privacy and protecting the right of privacy and patrons in particular. Now, if we look around us today, somehow we're in the situation where this information still goes everywhere, right? Like all of a sudden we have all these technologies that keep tracking us all the time, collect information about us, and it seems really difficult to be in control and take control of your privacy. So it's great that we have all these fancy definitions of what privacy is and why we need to protect it, but the reality seems to look quite different. And the reason for that is that there are lots of competing interests and tensions when it comes to privacy, right? So from the individual perspective, yes, we want to be private, but we also want to socialize and we want to present ourselves and also make use of nice convenience functions like smart speakers or all kinds of smartphones and apps, right? And then on the other side of the tension, we have national security, safety, law enforcement, and that are happy to actually leverage all data traces that all of us leave to go after some perpetrators that might be hiding in there. And then there are, of course, also business interests that go against privacy, right? And then technology is really kind of a catalyst in this, an exacerbating function, right? So through our technological advancements, by making everything smart and more digital, we keep creating more traces, more information that then can be leveraged in all other kind of ways and seems to be slowly eroding privacy. And what I want to do today is I'm going to give you like an overview of some of the the ways privacy is being invaded and what harms might come from that. And then we're going to spend some time talking about what can we do about it, right? Is privacy dead, or do we still have a chance here? So the first thing I shortly want to talk about is online tracking, right? So this information going everywhere. We see this every time we go to a news website or any kind of website, right? When you go to the New York Times, there are probably 10 to 20 other companies making a record of you reading this particular article you've never heard about. And why can they do that? Because they come with the advertisements that are shown by the New York Times, or the New York Times. I'm picking on the New York Times because they have this great article, but it applies to any other news outlet as well, right? They might have analytics services that track reach of certain articles and so forth, but in doing so also create or have the ability to create profiles about these individual people. This often happens not in an identified way, right? So it's not that the New York Times necessarily knows that I, Florian Schaub, looked at this particular article, but rather that someone with this IP address has done this. And then they place a cookie in your browser, which is basically a code snippet, which then is sent every time you go to the same website again, or where the same tracker is present. And that allows these trackers to kind of keep chaining together a profile of your online behavior. And then use that to infer all kinds of things about you, right? So based on the articles you read, it's possible to infer your political leanings, or even just the news outlets you read, right? Are you in the market for a car, right? What are other interests you might have? And this is, of course, valuable information for advertisers. The same happens in the mobile space. So instead of cookies, many mobile apps actually have third-party code libraries integrated into the app, which are used for different purposes, right? So things like displaying a map in your mobile app, that's probably a third-party service. And showing advertisements are third-party services. But once these third parties are in the app, they can actually also often access any resources you granted this particular app access to, right? That could be your location, that if you share your contacts with a specific app, it is quite possible that your contacts are being forwarded to that third party as well, which then is useful to create kind of your social network, right? Who you hang out with. And also now we have email addresses and phone numbers of other people we might want to advertise to. So it's kind of ubiquitous. And it doesn't stop in the online world, right? So if we think about stores, stores have actually been doing this type of tracking for the longest time. And if you have a loyalty card, right, it means that the reason that stores are offering these loyalty programs is to be able to chain together your different purchases and keeping track of what are the things you're buying, how often are you buying in the store, right? And then that information is used to infer profiles of customers, but also market to you specifically. And this particular story I have here from 2012 was about Target and how Target was particularly interested in advertising to pregnant women. And the reason that pregnant women are a choosy target for advertising, so to speak, is that when you're pregnant, you have lots of life changes, right? All of a sudden, you need to buy diapers, you need to buy wipes. I have 2 small kids. I know how it is, changing diapers and whatnot. And so it's a good moment in life to actually sway people to change their habits, because everything in your life is changing anyway, right? If I now get you to buy the discounted diapers in my store, maybe you can also buy other things in there. And what Target, through their data analytics, found is that they could predict whether someone was pregnant, not just because they bought a pregnancy test, but based on whether they purchased cotton balls and unscented soap, right? Like these were kind of like initial cues that someone is likely pregnant, and then they would use this to send people coupons about baby-related items. There was an uproar because of that article because what actually happened is that Target had sent such a baby-oriented coupon to a 16-year-old, and then the father complained that surely Target must be out of their minds advertising to his underage daughter baby things. Are they trying to plant ideas here? What's going on? And then a couple of weeks later, the father had to apologize that there were apparently things going on in his house he was not aware of. And advertisers have gotten smarter since then. So instead of sending you a coupon booklet with all baby stuff, they just send you a sheet where like a couple of things are baby themed, right? But there's also dog food and other things that kind of blend in and make it seem less innocuous. Okay, the audio is very quiet. Let's see if we can fix this.
Can you move your laptop mic closer?
It's right here.
Okay.
I can move closer to the microphone and hope that helps. If you still have problems, please let me know.
I can hear you fine.
Okay. Another related problem is that is location tracking, right? So you have apps that you download on your phone that track your location, but your internet service provider or your phone carrier are also tracking your location and actually selling this information, for example, in this case, to bounty hunters. Right? So if you pay $300, you can locate someone's phone pretty accurately without you knowing that this is happening. And this is just kind of the tip of the iceberg when it comes to this hidden data economy, right? So data brokers are entities, companies that their whole business is to gather data either by directly tracking users or by buying data from other companies who are tracking it, and then reselling that data for a profit, right? So what that could look like is that these data brokers offer data enrichment services to companies. So if I have a customer or if I have a user who signs up to my platform and they use their email address or their phone number, right, then I can go to a data enrichment service as a company and buy additional data for that phone number or for that email address. And that can include your date of birth, your gender, your address or the region you live in, as well as your interest profile, right? Like what are the things you might be interested in? What kind of person are you? Inferred, of course, from clicks you've made online or through mobile apps and so forth, and not necessarily inferred in an accurate manner, right? But you never have, you as a person don't really have a relationship with these data brokers or don't even know who they are. And recently there are laws that actually require data brokers to register, at least in Vermont, that's the case. And there's a hope that there will be more oversight of these data brokers in other states as well. Now, when we think about libraries and the traces we leave in libraries, I think we're seeing a shift in libraries as well, how more and more digital services and databases are being used for all kinds of aspects, right? Ranging from providing access to papers and resources that are just online, books that are online, to digital loans that then are, for example, sent to your Kindle device via Amazon, so forth, right? And every time you have these interactions, there are data traces that are generated, and that creates whenever data is created, it creates a desire to use that data in for secondary purposes and secondary uses. For example, there might be database vendors or library vendors that then sell aggregated data to data brokers, right? About like what is information certain people are using. Some of these large publishers like Elsevier, Springer, and so forth are increasingly offering data analytics services based on people who use their databases. This particular article I have here by Sarah Landon talks about how ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, is relying on or buying lots of data, not directly from libraries, but from all kinds of vendors to identify individuals who might be undocumented, for example. And one of the examples given in the article is that they buy access to LexisNexis, which, among other things, indexes court cases. And so you can do word search on these court case filings in order to then flag individuals that might be of interest to go after. Now, in terms of harms, okay, so yes, all this information is tracked, right? But how does that affect me, or why should I care about this? And the first thing is chilling effects, right? So when people are aware that they're being tracked, they change their behavior. This here is a graph for Wikipedia searches for terrorist-related topics, things like Al-Qaeda, dirty bomb, chemical weapons, jihad, and so forth on Wikipedia, right? And what you can see is that when the first Snowden revelations came out in mid-June, and it became clear that the NSA is actually tracking a lot of online activity in a holistic manner, searches dropped substantially and kept decreasing further for these topics. And now you could argue, well, okay, maybe it's not a bad thing if people are not searching about terrorism topics, but it kind of prevents people also from learning about the side effects of this. Right? And similar things have been perceived for Google search as well. There's also the risk of unwanted disclosure. What can that look like, right? So in 2018, Strava, the fitness tracking company, they had this world activity map where you could see, oh, where have our users been running? Right? And the idea was to kind of show like, oh, this is a global community of runners that are active. But one of the side effects was that in the African desert, all of a sudden you could see landing strips pop up and army bases pop up that were otherwise not visible, right? So just by Strava deciding, oh, we're going to make this aggregated data available, they actually they created national security risks. A more individual privacy harm is identity theft, right? So your data being used against you in certain ways. And the person shown here is Lori Craner, who in 2016 was the chief technologist of the Federal Trade Commission. And in her day job, she's the director of the Carnegie Mellon Scilab Security and Privacy Institute. So I'd consider her one of the leading experts in privacy and security, right? But she had her phone hacked in 2016. What happened is that one morning, her phone didn't work anymore, didn't connect to the network. And when she got hold of her husband, he had the same problem. And so they called AT&T, and AT&T said, well, yeah, of course, we just upgraded you to your new iPhone. But she hadn't bought a new iPhone. So what had happened is that someone walked into a store in Ohio with her name, her phone number, and a fake ID of her, and used that to walk out of the store with 2 new iPhones, which were then charged to her account as well, of course. And the way this worked is that they must have gotten hold of her phone number and then used these kind of data enrichment services to actually buy additional information, including the name and other things, finding photos of her and then faking an ID, right? So the information that is out there about you can be really damaging. And of course, Lori Craner is a prominent figure, or a somewhat prominent figure, right? But similar things happen all the time to regular people as well. And then the more subtle risks that are not as visible have to do with discrimination. Recently, there were issues around Facebook having biased advertisement. We often see this in job ads in particular, that men get ads for high-paying jobs, women get get advertisements for help wanted or or temporary positions. And there are other studies that have shown that when people's social media profiles reveal their religion or their sexual orientation, that this information is used by employers to discriminate against people in terms of who they invite for interviews. And that's a problem. And what we also see is that these privacy issues affect the general population, but they often affect people of lower socioeconomic status, poorer communities, much more than the general public. And there's a great book by Virginia Eubanks, Automating Inequality, that talks about how the poor are really the ones that are being constantly surveilled. It's a great report by Data and Society that looks deeper at this as well. And so when thinking about privacy, one thing I want you to think about is not just these kind of tangible harms, right? Like, oh God, my identity got stolen, or like something I posted on social media was then seen or leaked to someone who shouldn't have seen it. But the more pressing problems are actually absence of opportunity. And like, you will often not know when information about you is being made based on your digital traces or your behavior or your online behavior, right? You will not know if you didn't get a job interview because of a 20-year-old photo on social media. And these are the really challenging privacy problems. And the Pew Research Center not too long ago released a new survey focused on privacy. And they found that the majority of US adults are highly concerned about privacy. But at the same time, they also perceive a lack of control, right? They feel like they have very little control over the data that are collected by the government or by companies. And even though they're concerned about it, what we also know is that people don't really seem to be taking action, right? It's not like people throw away their smartphones or quit social media en masse. So what I want to talk a little bit about is why are people struggling to control their privacy so much, right? And the first thing is that it's really hard. So if you want to even understand what's going on, well, you could go and read privacy policies, but these are long, they're difficult to read, right? And if you would actually want to read the privacy policies of all the websites you visit, you would have to spend 244 hours a year to do so. And this is a study by Alicia McDonald and Lori Craner, we just heard about her, from 2008, right? 2008, that's before smartphones, that's before Ring doorbells, before voice assistants in your homes, before smart cars, right? Think about how much more time you probably would have to spend in 2019, right? But how did we end up here? Why are these privacy policies so long and unreadable? And like the reason we have this need for transparency and requirement for transparency in all privacy laws or data protection laws is that the idea is to address information asymmetry, right? So companies know exactly what they're doing with the information. We're forcing them to be transparent about it so that consumers can make informed decisions about which companies should be able to have access to their data and make use of that data, right? And then regulators can also use this information to enforce against companies. However, what we've been seeing over the last 20, 25 years is that these privacy policies have become much more of a tool for companies to communicate with regulators than with the actual consumer. Right? And that's why we have super long privacy policies. Here's a nice example from the New York Times privacy project. What they did is they looked at the top websites and their privacy policies, and they charted their readability in comparison to works of literature. Right? And it's quite concerning that the Facebook privacy policy they looked at here requires a higher reading level than a Brief History of Time, which is Stephen Hawking's book on the space-time continuum, right? But hey, at least you don't need to have quite as high of a reading level, advanced reading skill as is needed for Immanuel Kant's critique of pure reason, right? So there's still some space there. And I didn't single out Facebook. That was just the one highlighted by the New York Times project. But you can see all these blue dots are other privacy policies of companies, and it gets actually much worse than Facebook's privacy policy here. In our own research, we studied how privacy policies changed around the introduction of the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe. So for this particular project, we tracked the privacy policies on the website, on the top 500 websites in each of the European countries. So over 6,000 different websites in total. And we looked at all kinds of things, but one of the factors we looked at is how long are these policies? And we found that after the GDPR went into effect last May, policies were on average 3,000 words long. Right? That's a lot to read for something that is probably not your main concern, right? Like when you're signing up for a new service, you're not looking at a service or an app because you think like, oh, I really want to read a privacy policy, right? Like you want to play that game, or you need to do your taxes, something like that. So reading 3,000 words seems like not a very great proposition. It's also a bit concerning is that these policies were 42% longer than the ones in 2016 when the GDPR was ratified, right? So the GDPR is very likely the reason why these policies are so long, so much longer now. But the problem is not necessarily that the privacy policies are long. I think from my perspective, the problem is that we pretend privacy policies are consumer information tools. They're really written by companies and company lawyers for regulators and the lawyers working in regulators, right? And if we would acknowledge that reality, then we could actually make them even longer, like SEC filings, which are also very long, right? And much more detailed. And then in addition to those detailed privacy policies, we would have some additional information for consumers we could provide on top of that. And then like a good example why it doesn't really pay off to read the privacy policies is what happened this year with smart speakers, right? So some of you might have heard of this. In April, Bloomberg released a story that Amazon had employees listen to audio recordings of smart speakers. And then later on, it came out that the same was true for Apple and Facebook and Google as well with their voice assistants. And from a technologist perspective, that was not that surprising. If you're training a classifier, a speech recognition system, right, you need to annotate edge cases in order to improve your classifier. So if the system keeps misunderstanding people, the only way to improve on this is to have a human listen to this and be like, no, machine, actually, this is what that person meant. Right? But the problem is that's not intuitive for the general public or people who don't have an advanced computer science degree, and it shouldn't have to be. But if you looked into the Alexa frequently asked questions, right, they talk about how they improve voice recordings, but the only thing they say is, we use your requests to train our speech recognition and natural language understanding systems, right? So it really requires advanced technological understanding to make the leap from this particular sentence to, oh, okay, they probably have humans listen to what I say to Alexa in my bedroom at 2 a.m., right? And that's a leap that most people can't make without further training and also shouldn't be asked to make. So that's a problem, right? In other work, we looked at, well, when bad things happen, why do people not protect themselves better? So we analyzed how people reacted to the Equifax data breach in 2017 that exposed contact information and social security numbers of millions of US citizens and residents. And what we found in our study is that there were a couple of reasons why people didn't take action. One is optimism bias, right? I don't have much money. Why would identity thieves go after me? And that kind of assumes that identity thieves are making like a deliberate selection process, like, oh, okay, Kristen is a very juicy target, right? Like, let's go after her. Florian is a young assistant professor. He doesn't have much, doesn't doesn't make sense to go after him. But that's not how identity thieves operate, right? Like the way this works is you have these large databases of leaked information, and they're just going through and trying out different identities until one works for whatever purpose they're interested in. People also just have a tendency to delay, right? Like privacy is difficult, security is difficult. I don't want to deal with this, so I wait until something bad happens. And you know, if I don't get any cues that something bad is happening, so why should I bother? It's probably all okay. And that kind of leads to a false sense of security, right? Like people are doing one or two things, and then they think they're protected, and but they might not be. One of the big problems is jargon, right? Similar to the privacy policies, people just don't know what all these technical terms mean. In the case of the Equifax breach, when we asked people of whether they had placed credit freezes, most people thought we were talking about, the materials were talking about basically getting a credit card blocked, right? So credit report and credit card kind of get mixed up. Cost was also an issue, going back to that inequality issue, right? Like at this time when we conducted the study, it cost $10 to freeze your credit and another $10 to unfreeze your credit. Since then, the Congress actually passed a law that requires credit freezes and unfreezes to be free. It's one of the rare occasions where things actually happen quickly, and between our research, us conducting our research and publishing the paper, in the meantime, Congress had actually acted, which usually never happens. So that was nice to see. And then another interesting finding of this work was that the source of advice had a big impact, right? So most people had heard about this breach through the news, and they also had heard about what they should be doing, place a credit freeze and so forth, but didn't really act on this. The moment they acted is when trusted people told them to do that, right? That can be your family members, like the tech-savvy person in the family, right? Or colleagues, but could also be your librarian, right? Who says, hey, you should really pay attention to this. Here are the 3 steps you need to do to be safe after the breach. And then, but then also another problem is that these breach notifications that we get in the mail or in our inboxes all the time are just not designed to really help people. So we did this study where we analyzed 161 data breach notifications sent to consumers in detail. And one of the things we found is that except for 2, all of them fell in the difficult to read category using some kind of automated readability metric. Right? And then we further looked at these, and what we also saw is that a lot of them used hedge terms. Right? So we recently identified and addressed a security incident that may have involved your personal information. You're sending me a letter about a data breach. If I was not involved, why am I getting this letter? Right? But by including this may here and saying like, oh, we're not quite sure if you were involved, it reduces the urgency for consumers to actually act on this letter, because it's like, oh yeah, you know, maybe I was involved, but maybe not. We also saw a lot of no evidence claims. At this time, we're not aware of any fraud or misuse of your information as a result of this incident. That sounds reassuring, right? So I probably don't have to worry about it and probably don't need to do anything else. But I mean, did this company who was affected actually check whether my data was misused? Right? Maybe it's kind of like when you rent a home, or when you're a property owner, right, and you want to rent out your house. As long as you don't know that there's lead in the house, you don't need to actually disclose it. So it's kind of a similar situation here. Very problematic. And then there are recommendations of what to do, but they're often buried in long paragraphs like this, right? Unless you read this in detail, it's difficult to get that this is actually about a fraud alert, and this tells you to freeze your credit reports, but it doesn't help you to actually prioritize between these two, and the much more effective one is actually a credit freeze that should be taken here. So lots of problems there, right? And when we think about how people make privacy decisions, a problem is that people are often not fully aware of the risks they're facing, and even have uncertainty about their own preferences. Right? Like privacy is very contextual, The more uncertainty we have about risks and what is the right thing we should be doing in a moment, the more we're relying on contextual cues to help guide our decisions. And that means we actually become very malleable, very susceptible to people trying to sway our behavior. And so here's an example. It's a study done by some of our colleagues here, where they showed that how you presented a newsfeed, what items you highlight in a newsfeed, actually has a large impact on what people perceive as appropriate behavior or appropriate posts. Right, so these are screenshots of the same website. It's kind of like an Instagram dating site kind of website that the researchers created. And on the left side, it mainly shows R-rated photos. And on the right side, there are photos of people who wear more clothes. But if people only see the R-rated version, if you show them then another R-rated picture, they're much more likely to say that's an appropriate picture than in the case on the right, right? So companies that use algorithms to determine what is shown to you and personalize this have a lot of power in determining what you perceive as the social norm on a given service. Another big aspect in kind of companies influencing people's behavior is choice architectures. It's an economics term, but basically what it means is what are actually the choices that are available to you and how are they being presented to you. In Europe, because of the GDPR, we see a lot of cookie banners these days. Right? So they're these kind of banners, but if you don't have an actual choice, right, you can't make a choice. You just have to, you can only click this away and that's it. I don't know if this is still the current dialogue, but this used to be the dialogue for Facebook when you wanted to deactivate your account. Right? And among other things, you actually had to opt out additionally of receiving future emails from Facebook, right? So I'm deactivating my account. They're clearly not deleting my account. It's actually much harder to get the account deleted. Another interesting aspect is here, they try to appeal to what you will be losing by this, right? Like your 656 friends will no longer be able to keep in touch with you. And then they even photos and names of the people who will miss you. And what they're using here is loss aversion, right? People do not like to lose things they already have. So they're kind of emphasizing, this is what you're losing. Are you sure you really want to do this? And a different term for this type of behavior is dark patterns. So dark patterns are interface cues, interaction cues that are meant to deceive people to reveal more information. Right? You might have seen kind of these profile strength indicators on LinkedIn and other sites that are meant to get you to 100%, right? Incentivize you to get to 100%. And there are all kinds of other things. And the Norwegian Consumer Council in 2018 put out a report, Deceived by Design, that catalogs a lot of these issues in popular companies. It's very interesting and very readable if you're interested in this topic. And then in our own work with smart speakers, we found that even though these smart speakers have a lot of controls, they have a mute button at the top. You need the wake word, hey Alexa, before that device actually records what you're saying. We found that people are not using these controls for multiple reasons. One is that they didn't really understand how the controls worked. So for example, for the mute button, people didn't think it was muting the microphone. They thought it would be muting the speaker. So they didn't use it because of that. And then another problem was that the privacy controls at that time made it really difficult for people to actually use them. The way you interact with a smart speaker or a voice assistant is by voice. You talk to the smart speaker. Right? Hey Alexa, do this and that. But then if you want to control your privacy, you have to walk to the speaker and press a button, or you have to pull out your mobile phone and go into the app and then make an adjustment there. So it's much harder, and it actually requires you to change your interaction modality. So it just creates a bit more friction. We also found that people actually use some of these privacy controls to invade other people's privacy. So part of the privacy controls is that you can review what people have said to the device, and people use that to spy on their house sitters or babysitters, or to keep recordings of their kids as mementos. Other work has shown that kids, when they learn about this, find this very, very creepy and do not like that. Okay, so these are the negative things, right? But I think there's also some hope. So while I think we're kind of like in the valley when it comes to how bad things can get with privacy, and we're just starting to climb the hill a little bit. There's actually a lot of reasons for companies to care about user privacy. Last but not least, legal requirements and liability, but also user trust. Companies like Apple have really understood that privacy can be a business case. And it's not just the right thing to do, but it also gets people to trust you. If you invade people's privacy, it has a negative impact on your reputation. But there's also a business case, really, in the sense that if you're already complying with privacy laws and data protection laws around the world, and all of the big US companies are complying with the much stricter European data protection requirements, you might want to make sure that you actually get these benefits of increased user trust and other things as well by making these tools usable and useful for people instead of wasting resources on them. And then you don't want to find yourself here, right? Like more and more tech companies and CEOs of tech companies are actually being investigated for privacy violations. The Federal Trade Commission this year issued a $5 billion penalty for Facebook. And that was the largest penalty the US government has ever issued against a private company. Right? It was pretty momentous, except for the fact that Facebook's revenue in 2018 was 55 billion. And so it's all relative. However, one of the things that kind of was maybe not as deeply reported is that parts of that FTC settlement was also that they really deeply reached into how Facebook makes decisions about privacy and created a privacy compliance structure that makes Mark Zuckerberg as the CEO personally liable for privacy violations going forward. In other good news, Google was fined 57 million under the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe earlier this year. And there are a couple of other cases in the pipeline at the moment that likely will turn out to be in the similar range or higher even against different companies, which kind of shows that the General Data Protection Regulation really has teeth and has companies pay attention. Here in the US, we will actually have a new privacy law next year. By we, I mean at least the people in California, which is the California Consumer Privacy Act. And that is based on the GDPR. Some people call it GDPR light, but it has some stricter limitations on what companies can do with data. And it also requires companies who make a business of selling people's data to have a button on the front page of their website that says, do not sell my data, do not sell my personal information. Right? So things are happening, and it's going to be interesting to see how the other states or the federal government is going to react. And there's actually some hope that we might get a federal privacy law in the next couple of years. And then there are also examples of how privacy policies can work much better. The Gramm-Leach-Pliley Act, which has to do with the financial industry, required annual notices, privacy notices, be sent to consumers. And then 7 federal government agencies got together and developed a model privacy notice, which fits on 2 pages and has all the key information. And some of you might have seen some of these already, but it's really reduced in communicating why information is being collected, what information is being collected, and is this information shared with other partners, and can you opt out of this? And if yes, how can you opt out of this? Right, so it's trying to lay out this information in a very compact way. When it comes to data breaches, what we found is actually that 94% of the data breach notifications we analyzed used headings that were required in the California Data Breach Notification Law. The headings are over here: what happened, what information was involved, what we are doing, what you can do. Right? So it shows that there's really potential to also make things more usable if regulation is kind of written with that in that regard, and that this information can look better than 3,000 word privacy policies. Where we also see actual choices on smartphones, right? Now both iOS and Android have these just-in-time permission dialogues that allow you to say no if you don't want an app to access your location, access your contacts, and other things. In our own work, we found that also reminding people about what apps are accessing their location is very, very powerful to get people to review their settings and make changes. Amazon this year announced that they will now have voice commands that you can tell Alexa to delete everything that you said today, right? So things are moving in the right direction. There's still more work to be done, but I think there's some hope that people will at least get some better control about privacy. Now I want to spend a few more minutes to talk about what libraries can do in this regard, right? So I talked about how many vendors and particular database vendors might be looking for secondary uses of data. So when libraries are thinking about adopting new services or vendors, right, looking at the privacy risks in particular is important to get a sense of, well, what are they doing with the data? And depending on whether that's concerning, negotiate for better privacy. Say, we're not okay with this. We cannot use your service if that's how you treat our patrons. I think there's also an opportunity to innovate with partners, right? So I know many libraries are kind of resource constrained, but find privacy researchers, security researchers, information scientists, LIS students, right, who are excited about helping libraries and working with you to help patrons to educate them about privacy risks and find solutions that work for you and your library. And then a small thing, check your own website using like a browser extension such as Ghostery or the EFF's Privacy Badger to see whether you have trackers on your website. Make sure you don't. And then once you know what are the risks with your services you're offering, right, inform patrons about those risks and protections so that they're also aware, not just what the problems are, but also what you're doing to helping them and protecting them. I think another important aspect is really thinking about how libraries can educate patrons about privacy risks more generally, right, and providing guidance for privacy self-defense. I think what we found valuable in this is to try to really make it relevant to the people, like what are the challenges that they are facing, right? So social media privacy course may be more relevant for teenagers than for older adults potentially. And making sure they understand the risks and giving them actionable advice, right? And actionable advice could look like this, right? So really checking the privacy policy, and don't mean read every privacy policy of every website you go to, but when you sign up for a new service that potentially collects sensitive information about you, financial data, address data, location data, get a sense of what they're doing with that data. And they often have some kind of opt-outs in terms of marketing, right? So make use of those opt-outs. And the first thing I always do is when I have a new app or a new device or anything is I check the privacy settings. What are the privacy settings? And beware of default settings. Almost always the defaults are privacy invasive, but you can make changes that protect you better. Then using a browser extension to block trackers on websites is really helpful and important and doesn't really affect your browsing much, except that you're not being tracked by all these companies you don't know. Placing a credit freeze. And then the last thing is a bit of common sense, right? Like when people ask you for stores ask you for your phone number, ask why and refuse. I don't give out my phone number in stores. I don't see a reason for that. And also fake it, right? If the information is asked that you think is not relevant for what you want to accomplish here, be smart about it and give fake information. And these are just a couple of resources that I want to list. I think we can post those under the video as well once it goes public. But there are actually lots of really interesting resources to also use to educate other people. And yeah, finally, so my takeaways for you today is privacy is worth protecting. There's a value to it. It's getting harder and harder with technology, but we're also seeing some improvements, and it's important to be vocal about that privacy protections is something you care about and that companies should care about and that politicians should care about. And we can break resignation about all of these bad data collection by just adopting a couple of small steps. That's it from me, and I'm happy to take some questions in the remaining minutes.
So if you've got questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. While we're asking, can you talk a little bit about your cell phone research?
You mean regarding how you make people aware of what apps are collecting data, or?
More in terms of how giving your cell phone number may be an identifier that you may or may not wish were being collected.
Yeah, right. So the problem is that phone numbers are being used more and more as identifiers, particularly by mobile apps. But as I mentioned earlier, they're also, if you're using them in different places, they become your identifier that allows people to link different parts of your identity together. And phone numbers are particularly liked by data brokers for that reason, because they don't change that often for most people. So yeah, being careful with giving out phone numbers, I think, is really important.
So we've got a question from Katrina. What can librarians do to help inform their patrons about privacy in an interesting way that seems relevant to them? Are there programs or flyers we can put out for them?
Yeah, so I think what you're hinting at is the point of how do you make it interesting, right? And I think what can be interesting is to, like, simple tasks and exercises, even like, hey, let's Google ourselves, right? And most people will be really surprised what information about them is online. Yeah, using some of these kind of invasive tools to show what data can be collected, finding examples of how data tracking works, for example, installing a browser extension like EFF's Privacy Badger or Ghostery, and then showing like, hey, here are all these companies that are keeping track of what you're doing, is a good start. And then I shortly had this slide up with resources where there are more specific examples. I think the important part is to really give examples, but then also give specific steps for action. And I wish I could say this is the only pamphlet you should hand out to people, but unfortunately it doesn't exist yet. And I think there's still a lot of need to really package this information in a more meaningful way. I think what's relatively good is the consumer reports page I have linked here. They did this 2 years ago where they kind of listed out 66 privacy tips, but a lot of it is also overkill. Like what annoys me sometimes with privacy advice is that it's just not realistic. Not everyone's going to start using a virtual private network for all of their browsing because it's way too difficult to set up. And there are all kinds of things you could do, like deactivate location services on your smartphone. Yeah, you can do that, but you also get value from location services on your smartphone, right? So I think thinking about what are actually steps that people can do that doesn't inconvenience them or doesn't inconvenience them too much, and at the same time kind of being aware of what the problems are they're facing.
Okay, so my next question comes from Aaron. Do you have any comment on using the Brave browser or alternatives to the big browsers besides Tor? And while you think about the answer, the new Firefox actually has tracker blockers by default.
Yeah, so I think Brave, Firefox are good browsers to use. I mean, they function pretty much as any other browser, but have additional privacy protections. So the main thing is basically preventing tracking to some extent. I don't know if anyone has done like a deeper analysis of which of these browsers is maybe more effective. Brave is pretty new, right? They're still figuring out their business model as well. So if you use Brave, I would kind of keep an eye out on well, how are they making their money? But particularly Firefox, I think, is a good recommendation in general. But a good browser only goes so far. I think the much bigger privacy issues often have to do with what we do online, and are there maybe additional steps we can take to protect ourselves? Oh, and Tor was mentioned. So for those who are not familiar with Tor, Tor is a browser that uses an anonymization network and basically kind of obscures where a request to a website is coming from. And that's also something that can be used. It's very easy to install. Like by now, you just install it as any other browser. But it's relatively slow because all the traffic goes through the anonymization network. So it's not the best thing to watch YouTube, but it's maybe a good thing to look up things you don't want to be tracked.
And final question. I'm happy to learn the ways in which we can educate ourselves about data privacy, but when do you see that the individual will have the means and ability to take advantage of their own data in this data economy?
Yeah, that's a good question. So one interesting thing about the European data protection law is that it includes the right to access to your data. And we have that as well here in the US with the Federal Trade Commission's Fair Information Practice Principles. But in Europe, it's a core requirement. And it means that data subjects, people can place access requests to companies and then get back the data in a form that needs to be also machine readable. So they can't just send you back, here's your big stack of data printed out on lots of paper. And the hope is that this will develop into a way for people to also export the data and use it for their own purposes. I think one area where we're seeing kind of like this data exchange happening much more is in the financial industry, where I don't know if you use a software to file your taxes, right? It's actually very easy to connect your bank to TurboTax or something like that, and they automatically exchange data, but it all goes through middle entities, right? Like you're not actually the one who has the data. Yeah, I think usable tools to make sense of data are maybe missing still.
All right, well, our time has elapsed for today, so we want to thank Florian for being here. We want to thank you all for being here and for giving us some feedback to know more about what topics you'd like to hear about and how we can better serve you in libraries. Our next webinar is coming up on December 10th, also a Tuesday at 4 o'clock. Melissa Johnston will be talking about STEM and digital tools, and that webinar is also free, and you can register at the Eventbrite link. There's a question, and coming up then in 2020, social workers in libraries, particularly featuring social workers in rural libraries, web accessibility with our colleague Colleen Van Lenten, design thinking with the University of Maryland's Mega Subramanian. So with that, we'll bring the webinar to a close. Karen, we're not doing certificates of participation, but if you email me at the email address that I am putting in the chat right now, I can send you an email that says you were here. Thanks, guys. If there's nothing else, we'll bring this webinar to a close.
Thanks, everyone.